Good afternoon. Good afternoon. If I could get your attention for 1 sec. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Legacy Project. We're glad to see so many people in the crowd. A lot of people are here, a lot of students from CCM, and we know we got some people from the public. We have a very exciting event for you. This would probably be a good time to silence your cell phones. We have a great program for you, and we just want to make sure there's no distractions. The Legacy Project is a new initiative here at County College of Morris. It began with discussions in the communication department and now includes several departments in the liberal arts division. Every semester, the Legacy Project presents an important program remembering and contextualizing an influential moment in history. In the fall semester, many of you know, we honored the civil rights movement and traced the work of activists in the 1960s to today's society. This semester, we look at the Beat generation, in particular, the role of women and the French-Canadian heritage of its most famous author. We are honored today to have distinguished writers and scholars, Joyce Johnson and Hedy Jones, to share some stories and insights into this era and the people they encountered on the streets and in the late-night cafeterias of New York City. When putting this program together, myself and fellow co-chairs Emily Burks and Michelle Altieri quickly realized that many people in the audience may not understand much about the Beat generation, although the influence and impact of the Beats continue today, touching upon literature, gender, sexuality, and politics. Today's public may find it difficult to connect the dots of a generation of people who resisted post-war conservatism, who attempted to define freedom along different terms, who discovered painful and liberating truths on the highways of America, in the apartments of Manhattan, in the creative corners of Greenwich Village. Yes, there was the poetry. Yes, there were the novels. Yes, there was the bebop music. Yes, there was the driving past another crossroads town where a line of tall, lanky men in jeans clustered in the dim light like moths in the desert, as Kerouac wrote in On the Road. And yes, there was the eventual returning to darkness. But the Beats were far more than an artistic output, far more than a mythic journey into the deep recesses of America. John Cleland Holmes, writing in the New York Times in 1952, looked out at this expanse of wayward youth, including the writers, artists, and musicians of the time, some gaining notoriety, some to remain anonymous forever, and realized that this generation of people, with the Second World War a recent memory, was a generation defined by how society interpreted their actions and how society often disregarded their yearning for a whole new culture. They were being marginalized, and yet they were seemingly comfortable in the margins. Holmes writes this: several months ago, a national magazine ran a story under the heading Youth, and the subhead, Mother is Bugged at Me. It concerned an 18-year-old California girl who had been picked up for smoking marijuana and wanted to talk about it. In her pale, attentive face, with its soft eyes and intelligent mouth, there was no hint of corruption. It was a face which could only be deemed criminal through an enormous effort of righteousness. Its only complaint seemed to be, why don't people leave us alone? It was the face of a Beat generation. Holmes, perhaps anticipating the monumental Beat scene that continued to thrive in the late 1950s, also had difficulty putting his finger on the pulse of this cultural heartbeat. In his attempt to define the generation, we come close to understanding the counterculture of the day. Holmes writes that the origins of the word beat are obscure, but the meaning is only too clear to most Americans. It implies the feeling of nakedness of mind and ultimately of soul, a feeling of being reduced to the bedrock of consciousness. In short, it means being undramatically pushed up against the wall of oneself. A man is a beat whenever he goes for broke and wagers the sum of his resources on a single number. And the young generation has done that continually from early youth. It would take some time and the requisite tenure of poverty, but eventually the major texts, On the Road by Jack Kerouac, Naked Lunch by William S. Burroughs, Howl by Allen Ginsberg, ended up in more mainstream channels. The discussions around the cafes of Columbia University and the bookstores of San Francisco evolved into a need to document this nakedness of mind. Then came the acceptance, but the struggles of this seemingly endless journey would continue. And that journey, sometimes across America, sometimes from 116th Street to Greenwich Village, is a close definition of what the Beats personified. On that journey are two important voices, that of Joyce Johnson and Hedy Jones, our distinguished guests today. Joyce writes in her remarkable memoir, Minor Characters, about a memorable trip from her parents' apartment in Morningside Heights all the way downtown to Washington Square Park. Her premonition that something was happening, something intangible but able to be experienced, seemed to float through the mind of Joyce and her friend Maria on this spring day in 1949. She writes, "As the bus lurches under the arch, Maria and I are leaning all the way forward in our seats, clutching hands. It's that moment when fantasy and expectation collide with reality, when what you've been told exists really turns out to be there, not quite as you've pictured it, but close enough." That first entry point, where they see the iconic arch of Washington Square Park, much like a voyager must have first glanced upon the lush countryside of the New World, was the beginning of an incredible story for Joyce, one that would include her own literary landmarks and encounters with everyone from Jack Kerouac to Allen Ginsberg to Hedy Jones. As Joyce's multi-year journey was taking place, Hedy was similarly discovering some of the realities of the burgeoning movement. At first, she experienced the mysterious terrain from the windows of her parents' car. She writes in How I Became Hedy Jones that the transfixing Houston Street pulled her attention away from her family's trip to Katz's Deli on the Lower East Side. I could see from our round gray 1946 Chrysler some streets I would have liked to set foot on. I could even have caught a quick piece of the village before we cut a sharp left and left it all behind at the Holland Tunnel. There was probably no way that Joyce and Hedy's worlds could stay separate for too long. They lived, they worked, they struggled, they broke from tradition, they survived, they wrote great stories and touched greatness themselves, they overcame. They were anything but minor. Using the words of Ann Douglas, they were young, gifted, and almost fearless. They were the Beats. Holmes would say they distrusted collectivity, but they never were able to keep the world out of their dreams. They are women, and their journey shaped the movement. Hedy writes about the kindred connection between her and Joyce, and perhaps this offers a window into the minds of the people who populated the generation. Hedy writes, "We shared what was most important to us, common assumptions about our uncommon lives. We lived outside as if we were men, as if we were newer, freer versions of ourselves. There have always been women like us. Poverty and self-support is enough dominion." Thank you, Hedy and Joyce, for being here today, and I hope you enjoy the program. To understand a little bit more about the Beats, I'd like to invite Danny Gonzalez to the podium. Danny is a CCM communication student preparing for graduation this May. He plans to attend Florida International University in the fall. He'll read a selection from Allen Ginsberg's Howl and Elise Cowan's The First Eye. Danny?
The First Eye by Elise Cowan. The first eye opens by the sun's warmth to stare at it. The second eye is ripped open by an apothecary and propped with toothpicks, systems and words, and likes to blink in mirrors. I only know there may be more because one hurts when I think too much. The first eye is blind. There is no other. A selection from Howl by Allen Ginsberg. For Carl Solomon. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who poverty in tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of Coldwater Flats, floating across the tops of cities contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake Light tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death or purgatory their torsos night after night, with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind, leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between, peyote solidities of halls, backyard green trees, cemetery dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftops, storefront burrows of tea-head joyride, neon blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ashcan rantings and King Kong light of mind, who chained themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine until the noise of wheels and children brought them shuddering, mouth-racked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo, who sank all night in submarine light of Bickfords, floated out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate fugazis, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox, who taught continuously 70 hours from park to pad, to bar, to Bellevue, to museum, to the Brooklyn Bridge, a lost battalion of platonic conversationalists jumping down the stoops, off fire escapes, off windowsills, off Empire State, out of the moon, yakety-yakking, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts and memories and anecdotes and eyeball kicks and shocks of hospitals and jails and wars, whole intellects disgorged in total recall for 7 days and nights with brilliant eyes, meet for the synagogue cast on the pavement, who vanished into nowhere Zen, New Jersey, leaving a trail of ambiguous picture postcards of Atlantic City Hall, suffering eastern sweats and Tangerian bone grindings and migraines of China under junk withdrawal in Newark's bleak furnished room, who wandered around and around at midnight in the railroad yard wondering where to go and went, leaving no broken hearts, who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow toward lonesome farms in Grandfather Night, who studied Platonist Poe's St. John of the Cross telepathy and Bob Kabbalah because the cosmos instinctively vibrated at their feet in Kansas, who loaned it through the streets of Idaho seeking visionary Indian angels, who were visionary Indian angels, who thought they were only mad when Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy, who jumped in limousines with the Chinaman of Oklahoma on the impulse of winter midnight streetlights, small-town rain, who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston seeking jazz or sex or soup, and followed the brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task, and so took ship to Africa, who disappeared into the volcanoes of Mexico, leaving behind nothing but the shadow of dungarees and the lava and ash of poetry scattered in fireplace Chicago, who reappeared on the West Coast investigating the FBI in beards and shorts with big pacifist eyes, sexy in their dark skin, passing out incomprehensible leaflets, who burned cigarette holes in their arms, protesting the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism, who distributed super communist pamphlets in Union Square, weeping and undressing while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down and wailed down Wall, and the Staten Island ferry also wailed. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Emily Burks. I'm a co-chair of the Legacy Project. And today I will be introducing both of our distinguished guests, and I will be moderating the discussion afterwards. So I'll begin with our first speaker, Joyce Johnson. She was born in New York, the city that has been the setting for all of her books. She entered Barnard College in 1951 at age 16, and at 19 she left home and landed her first job in publishing as a secretary at a literary agency. By that time, she had also begun work on her first novel, Come and Join the Dance, which was inspired by her determination to write about the real lives of young women, including a frank treatment of their sexual experiences, a taboo subject during the repressed 1950s. Because of her tumultuous life, it took her another 5 years to complete the novel. Although long out of print, it's regarded by scholars as an important contribution to beat literature, since it was the first beat novel written by a woman. In 1957, she met Jack Kerouac on a blind date arranged by Allen Ginsberg, the beginning of an affair that lasted for 2 years. Kerouac later wrote about their relationship in Desolation Angels. She was with him on the September night when the New York Times review of On the Road brought him instant fame as the voice of his generation, and she soon began to experience the heady excitement of being in the midst of an ongoing cultural revolution as the beat movement spread throughout America. She was also the first-hand witness of the destructive effects of Kerouac's celebrity. Her novel, Come and Join the Dance, was published in 1962 when Johnson was 26, but it was not until 1978 that her second novel, Bad Connections, was published. The intervening years were filled with demanding editorial jobs, 2 brief marriages, the birth of her son, and the challenge of becoming a single parent. Like many women artists, she had to put the creative work that meant the most to her aside. In 1981, working as an executive editor, she began getting up at dawn to work on her memoir, Minor Characters, about her coming of age in the 1950s and her involvement with Kerouac and the Beat Circle. It had taken her 25 years to get the right perspective upon that time and to see her own story as it related to the experiences of the young women of her generation. In 1983, the book won a National Book Critics Circle Award and has remained in print ever since. Ms. Johnson continues to write and publish memoir, commentaries, and critical interpretations of Kerouac and fiction. Her novels, Come and Join the Dance, Bad Connections, and In the Night Cafe, will soon be re-released as ebooks. We are very excited to have her here today to speak about Jack Kerouac and his French-Canadian roots. Please join me in welcoming Joyce Johnson.
I'm delighted to be here. Can you all hear me? Yeah, good. Title of my talk is A Half American Writer, and as I go on, you will understand the significance of that. It is possible to know someone and not know them, especially when you're 21 and in love, and when there are painful things the other person never talks about. For about 2 years, starting one night in January 1957, 9 months before the publication of On the Road, Jack Kerouac came and went in my life. I knew, of course, that he was of French-Canadian extraction, had a mother he called ma mère, who spoke to him in French, that he was very fond of French cooking, and that he still held on to his old dream of going to live someday in Paris, a dream he would never realize. In the spring of that first year I knew him, he finally did pass through there, completely broke as usual. But Paris, like nearly all of his dreamed-of destinations, was a disappointment. It didn't seem to want me, was how he put it. Perhaps part of the problem was that Parisians didn't think much of the way Jack spoke French. Before that, he'd been in London, where he'd made a point of looking up his family's Breton coat of arms in the British Museum Library. There he'd found the motto, aimer, travailler, souffrir, love, work, suffer, which he felt was the perfect summation of his life, as he told me when he was back in New York. I often heard him speaking in a low voice to my gray cat, to whom he'd given a French-Canadian name, Tigre, little gray one. He would feed Tigre in a way that never failed to charm me. Like a small boy, he'd lie flat on his belly with his chin against the rim of the cat's bowl, murmuring encouraging words, half in French, half in English. Many years later, when I read Visions of Gerard, the eerie significance of these little scenes dawned on me for the first time when I came to the lines, "When the little kitty is given his milk, I imitate Gerard and get down on my stomach. You happy, Tipoo? Your nice Lala?" I realized then that without knowing it, I had witnessed a secret sacrament, heard Jack Kerouac calling up his dead 9-year-old Franco-American brother, who was in some way the submerged half of himself. Jack never explained to me that when he was a kid in Lowell, Massachusetts, he had only spoken the French-Canadian language in his household, and that he had not been a fluent English speaker until his late teens. I would have been astonished to learn that all his life, to one degree or another, he had been translating the French words in which he dreamed and thought into their English equivalents. Like most people who read On the Road when it came out 6 years after Jack had written it, I would certainly never have thought of Jack as a bilingual writer, for I could think of no contemporary novelist who seemed so completely in the American grain. And my ear did not pick up the French overtones in Sal Paradise's voice, which was one of the things I now realize that gave Jack's first-person prose such a distinctive quality. That first-person voice seemed so natural and effortless, in fact, that I didn't realize it had taken Jack 10 years and piles of discarded manuscripts to finally arrive at it, or that it was a voice he'd kept suppressing in his writing, until in the spring of 1951, he'd finally embraced and accepted its power and written On the Road in the now legendary 21 days of concentrated effort in one long typed paragraph on a 120-foot scroll of paper. Jack did not mention Franco-Americans in the book I first read in its much-edited version, although its narrator, Sal Paradise, apparently Italian-American, expressed powerful feelings of identification with Black and Hispanic people. During the period I was involved with Jack, his publisher, Viking Press, despite the huge recent success of On the Road, turned down his first Lowell novel, Dr. Sachs, which dealt with his Franco-American childhood, and opened with the blatantly French-sounding sentence, "In Centralville, I was born." Now, we would say, I was born in Centralville. See how different it is with that inversion? In Centralville, I was born. That's sort of Jack's French sound. It did not occur to me that the book's ethnic subject matter may have been one of the reasons for this rejection and for the Viking editor's lack of interest in any novel about Jack's boyhood, though he was encouraged to write Dharma Bums as a follow-up to On the Road. Now that I've written my Kerouac biography, I'm sometimes amazed by how much I didn't understand during the time I knew Jack. Until it was possible for me to read Jack's journals in the Kerouac archive at the New York Public Library, I had never seen this revelatory passage he wrote at 23, shortly after the war had ended, just after he had taken a walk through his neighborhood in Queens. Today, Labor Day, a clear sunny day with the tender blue char in the sky hinting of October. I felt a resurgence of the old feeling, the old Faustian urge to understand the whole in one sweep and to express it in one magnificent work, mainly America and American life. Bunting, flying leaves, families drinking beer in their own backyard, cars filling the highways, children tanned and ready for school, the smell of roasts coming from the cottages on the leafy street, the whole rich American life in one panorama. I had the feeling that I was alien to all this, that all this could never be mine, only to express. All of this America, not for my likes, never. It's strange, since I'm aware that I understand all this, far more than the people who do have the American richness in them. Acknowledging the fact that because of the Breton bleakness in his soul, he would always feel like an outsider in this country, Jack called himself only half American. 6 years later, when it came time to write a novel that would sweep its readers westward across the American landscape, that novel would be written with the passion of an outsider. All this America, not for my likes, never. Doesn't that line sound directly translated from the French? And isn't that feeling of not entirely belonging here very American itself? In the fall of 1940, the incoming freshman John L. Kerouac arrived at Columbia on a football scholarship after spending 2 terms at the Horace Mann Prep School, where he'd been sent to make up some courses. This was a milestone in Jack's American journey. His entry into a university was the goal he'd set himself by the time he started high school, already knowing he wanted to be a writer, already aware there was no way he could use the French-Canadian language for the books he dreamed of writing, and that he would have to find a way of leaving Lowell, Massachusetts, where he had grown up in one of the insular French-speaking communities that could be found throughout New England. In his sophomore year, however, he would disappoint his family by walking away from his opportunity to get a college education. Football practice had given him little time for his studies and no time to write, and he had fallen under the spell of Thomas Wolfe. He took a bus southward, then changed his mind and went north. He found a job in a garage in Hartford, rented a small room and an Underwood typewriter, wrote one story after another, and experienced hunger for the first time. Not even the barrier of language could extinguish Jack's inborn need to write. From the time he was 11, he began working to make himself fluent in English, a process that continued into his adult life. He wrote a little novel, Jack Kerouac Explores the Merrimack, heavily influenced by Huckleberry Finn. His juvenilia includes some remarkable hand-printed newspapers, inspired by the racing papers his father constantly consulted for tips on horses. Calling himself Jack Lewis, Jack imagined himself its publisher, its chief reporter, a celebrated jockey, and the owner of a prize-winning horse he named Repulsion. He evidently loved the forceful sound of that word repulsion without knowing it meant the opposite of what he intended. Making a similar mistake, he made up a wizard named Dr. Malodorus. Dr. Malodorus was probably how he pronounced it. He considered this the most beautiful word he knew. At 17, when Jack was trying to write like William Saroyan, he papered the walls of his room with lists of words he'd found in the dictionary. At 22, in what he called his neo-Rambodian period, he was still working at increasing his vocabulary, writing the definitions of coalescent, ectogenic, dysphasia, and surah into his notebook in case he should ever need to use them. Smooth as surah, he wrote years later in Visions of Gerard, describing the skin of a character named Mr. Grosskorp. In Lowell, Jack had begun his education at the neighborhood parochial school Saint-Louis de France. There, the morning classes were taught in French, and the afternoon classes were taught in English. The students pledged allegiance to la race canadienne, as well as the American flag. The huge red brick mills along the Merrimack River pointed to the fate that awaited many of Jack's classmates, and that Jack would become determined to escape. Very few young Franco-Americans in Jack's day left the communities they'd been raised in or succeeded in going to college. Very few attempted the kind of lonely journey Jack would take into the American mainstream. "I don't even look like a writer," Jack would confess years later in his journal. "I look like a lumberjack." There was still tremendous prejudice against Jack's people, with most Americans believing they were backward and primitive. Dumb Canuck was a common epithet I even heard used teasingly by one of Jack's friends. But even in the 1950s, Franco-Americans still kept to themselves for other reasons. The almost mystical belief that they must uphold the old ideals and customs of what they called la survivance, the survival, and continue to speak their distinctive language, which was so woven into their religion. Lowell, the birthplace of the American Industrial Revolution, was a melting pot where people from various ethnic groups, Irish Catholic, Greek, Syrian, as well as a sprinkling of Jews, had come in the last decades of the 19th century to make their living in the mills, and where the French Canadians, escaping from starvation on their hard-scrabble potato farms in Quebec, have been willing to take the worst jobs. People from these different groups mingled in the mills and the bustling downtown streets and went home to their separate neighborhoods. Their children met each other in Lowell's public schools and on the baseball fields. There were handsome public buildings in Lowell, such as the public library, where Jack went every single Saturday and returned with as many books as he could carry, and the Athenaeum that had been built by wealthy New England mill owners. There were also neighborhoods of wooden tenements where there were frequent fires and epidemics of cholera and meningitis, and where many of the workers in the textile mills, where the windows were nailed shut, suffered from emphysema and tuberculosis. The deaths of children were not at all uncommon in Lowell. Jack's mother had grown up in the nearby town of Nashua and gone to work in a shoe factory at the age of 15. She could write English quite fluently, but never learned to speak it well. Jack's father, Leo Kerouac, was bright and enterprising, and his command of English was unusually good. He was a reader who believed that nothing compared to French culture and worshiped Balzac and Victor Hugo. Until he lost it during the Depression when the Kerouacs became poor, Leo had his own printing business, which did not confine itself to the Franco-American community. Compared to most French kids, Jack's early years were relatively privileged, although they were darkened by the death of his 9-year-old brother Gerard, a traumatic event that haunted Jack his entire life. Jack picked up his first words in English from the only Irish Catholic boy in his French-speaking kindergarten. He learned more from the half-days of instruction in his parish school, Saint-Louis de France, but he undoubtedly would have continued his French education through high school if the rezoning of his French Catholic middle school hadn't forced him to transfer to Bartlett Junior High in 7th grade. If this hadn't happened, his grasp of English might have remained uncertain and handicapped his writing. His parents registered him at Bartlett as a commercial student. He also went to high school as a commercial student. Embarrassed by his accent, one of the contributing factors to his lifelong shyness, he rarely spoke in his classes. Fortunately, a discerning English teacher noticed how surprisingly well Jackie Kerouac could write. She advised him to start going to the public library and recommended that he read Longfellow and Twain. Every Saturday, he took home an armload of books. He was a book-hungry kid who read indiscriminately and ravenously, everything from The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come to the novels of Jack London, Charles Dickens, and Arthur Conan Doyle. At 16, when he was cutting school to spend days at the library, he would discover Goethe, who had a lasting influence on his thinking. Jack was also addicted to pulp fiction, absorbing the American vernacular from the Shadow series, as well as from comics, sports novels, and westerns. Another important factor in Jack's Americanization were the movies he saw every Saturday from the balcony of Lowell's Royal Theater. There he watched cowboys gallop across the screen, heard the twang of W.C. Fields and the New Yorkese of Groucho Marx. His novels would be filled with cinematic references. Jack later admitted that the more he set himself to master English, the more he felt he'd lost some of his French. "I have no language of my own," he would tell Yvonne Lemaitre, who had reviewed his first novel, The Town and the City, for a Franco-American newspaper. It would take Jack a long time before he instinctively made the transition from one language to another. A note in his 1945 journal shows that it was still a process accompanied by a very conscious shifting of gears. First, Jack would have to remind himself that he was not writing in French. Then he had to figure out how to capture his simultaneous impressions in English. Then, because he was aiming at what he called sense thinking, he had to take care not to fall into the English literary tradition of reporting on what the writer was feeling. Jack's father believed that his son could rescue the family from poverty by becoming a football star. In his estimation, writers and artists were parasites. "There's no one with a name like Kerouac in the writing game," he told Jack, convinced that only a real Frenchman like Victor Hugo with a mastery of classical French could become a writer. The French-Canadian language as it was spoken in Lowell was not the French spoken in Paris or the French spoken in Montreal, where it was called joual. It was a richly expressive oral language that varied from place to place, and even in the early 20th century lacked fixed spellings. Joual had developed from the regional dialects the French settlers brought to Canada in the 17th and 18th centuries, plus an accumulation of words picked up from the Iroquois and the English. The Parisians said pomme de terre for potatoes. The Quebecois said patate. Jack's mother said moi for me. Victor Hugo said moi. Even as he was preparing himself to leave it behind, Jack was proud of the richness of his native language. "The language called Canadian French is the strongest in the world when it comes to words of power," he wrote at 19. "It is too bad that one cannot study it in college, for it's one of the languagey languages in the world. It is the language of the tongue and not of the pen. It is a huge language." In his 30s, he would defiantly begin to write passages in that language in his novels. In 1941, just as Jack began his second year at Columbia, he read Look Homeward, Angel by Thomas Wolfe, a writer with whom he felt an immediate psychological affinity and whose depictions of small town and urban America and richly maximalist prose style would have a tremendous influence upon the fiction Jack would attempt to write himself as he worked toward producing his own great American novel. All through his years of apprenticeship, Jack started many novels that he would decide to put aside, only completing 3 of them, the most important of which was The Town and the City, published in 1950. All of them were novels with an autobiographical base in which Jack heavily fictionalized his own experiences. All of his protagonists were given typical American names, and in none of these books did Jack deal with his Franco-American identity. Envisioning The Town and the City as a universal American story, Jack deliberately avoided emphasizing the Martin family's half-Franco-American background and their devout Catholicism. Isn't it true, he wrote to Yvonne Lemaitre, who would astutely raise questions about these issues, that French Canadians everywhere tend to hide their real sources? They were able to do that, Jack thought, because unlike other minorities, such as Jews or Italians, they could pass as Anglo-Saxon. A fiction writer today, in our multiculturally minded era, would make the most of his hyphenated background, and in fact would probably consider it an asset. But 60 years ago, the label Franco-American would have been a liability for an ambitious novelist. In 1946, while writing the opening chapters of The Town and the City, Jack had an idea for a road novel that he had to put aside for the time being. It would be a book in which a lone traveler recovering from a serious illness would take a journey across America, encountering a series of symbolic characters. Jack had yet to meet Neal Cassady, who would inspire the character Dean Moriarty, the all-American alter ego of the secretly French Sal Paradise. When Jack returned to this idea 2 years later after finishing The Town and the City, he found himself unable to get the novel off to a good start and had to discard one manuscript after another, which is certainly the most brutal form of revision. He planned to make the story with its all-American cast of characters even more elaborately fictionalized than the one in his first novel. But he seemed unable to find the right voice in which to write it. He still deliberately avoided using the first person and clung to the Woolfian first-person omniscient narration he had been using before. In 1950, following the disappointing reception of his first novel, the issue of obscuring his ethnic identity in his writing began to torment him. In May of that year, guilt Jack had not previously acknowledged rose to the surface. He recorded in his journal a dreamlike visitation from a Franco-American older brother who scolded him for trying to de-French himself. He hinted I should go to Lowell or Canada or France and become a Frenchman again and write in French and shut up. He keeps telling me to shut up. When I can't sleep because my mind is ringing with gongs of English thought and sentences, he says, pense en français, knowing I will calm down and go to sleep in simplicity. Jack saw this older brother as my original self returning after all the years since I was a child, trying to become an Anglais in Lowell from shame of being a Canuck. He wrote that it was actually the first time he understood that he'd undergone the same feelings any Jew, Negro, or Italian feels in America. So cleverly had I concealed them, even from myself, and with such talented, sullen aplomb for a kid. Jack spent that summer in Mexico City, a place that in many ways reminded him of Lowell, with its poverty and its many Catholic churches. There he continued to struggle with the road novel that was giving him so much trouble. After his mother forwarded him Yvonne Lamette's review of The Town and the City, in which he praised his writing but called his novel A Tree Without Roots, he immediately started on a new book called Gone on the Road, about a 15-year-old Franco-American kid from New Hampshire called Freddie Boncoeur, who hitches across America with an older and wiser cousin in search of Freddie's lost father. This novel, too, he put aside after returning to New York in the fall and resuming his frustrating attempts to write his road novel with American characters. It was a wonder that Jack didn't completely wear out his material or his desire to write on the road. In December, however, something very important happened that immediately opened up a new direction for his work. Jack received a 40-page confessional letter from Neal Cassady that immediately made him decide to renounce both fiction and fear. Energized by the power and fluency of working directly from memory, Jack responded to Neil with a series of memoir-like letters about his Lowell childhood and the death of his brother Gerard. It was the most stunning writing Jack had ever done, and he could feel it. "The voice is all," he wrote Neil triumphantly. He was finally starting to use the richly evocative first-person voice he'd been suppressing in his fiction. In March of 1951, Jack went even further, experimenting for the first time and writing entirely in French. His first experiment was the opening section of a projected novel called Sur la route, in an awkward French literary style he apparently had difficulty sustaining. His second experiment, La nuit est ma femme, The Night is My Woman, which he also called Les Travaux de Michel Breton, Michael Breton's Jobs, was far more successful. In fact, it's a wonderful piece of writing that has never been transcribed from his notebook and needs to be carefully translated and published so that everyone can read it. Written in a strong, direct, conversational first-person voice with great immediacy and intimacy, it tells the story of an unsuccessful Franco-American writer who has sacrificed everything to his creative work and feels the need to account for himself. In the manuscript, Jack wrote about his lifelong dilemma, the conflict between what a man had to do in order to survive and the dreams of immortality that kept him an artist's child, preventing him from making the compromises others made out of necessity and causing him to walk away from one demeaning job after another. He wrote about the mill whistles he used to hear in Lowell and his fear that he could end up as one of the workers trudging toward the factories that made him get a scholarship and start writing, and how the die was cast once he discovered the classic American writers, Twain, Melville, Thoreau, and Woolf, who wrote what he called unknown, unsoundable books. Jack translated one important passage from this book into English. "I wanted to write in a large form, which was free and magnificent like that, a form which would give me a chance to go out the window and not stay in the room all the time with old ladies like Henry James and his European sisters." He wrote the 60 pages of La nuit est ma femme in mid-March. In mid-April, when he sat down to write On the Road, he would keep the ingenuous-sounding forthrightness of the Michel Breton voice, as well as the overtones of its cadences, and the tinge of melancholy that washes through it, even when its energies seem highest. The voice he gave his first-person narrator would seem to Jack's future readers as American as apple pie, but it had been born in French. Thank you.
Our next guest is Hedy Jones. She's best known for her memoir, How I Became Hedy Jones, which remembers the beat scene of the 50s and 60s. She and her then husband, Leroy Jones, both played integral roles in the burgeoning movement. She's also the author of 23 books for children and adults, including the award-winning Big Star Fallen Mama, 5 Women in Black Music, and Drive, the first of her 3 poetry collections, which garnered the Poetry Society of America's Norma Farber Award. In addition to her own work, Jones has also written No Woman, No Cry for Rita Marley and co-authored From Midnight to Dawn, the last tracks of the Underground Railroad. Her short fiction has appeared in various literary journals such as Plowshares and Fence, and she has published reviews, articles, and stories in the Washington Post and the Village Voice, among others. Since 1979, Jones has taught writing at various universities and is now on the faculties of the New School's Graduate Writing Program and the 92nd Street Y Poetry Center. She is the former chair of the Penn Prison Writing Committee, and from 1989 to 2002 ran a writing workshop at the New York State Correctional Facility for Women at Bedford Hills, from which she published a nationally distributed collection called Aliens at the Border. This spring, she lectures as the Durst Distinguished Professor at the State University in Purchase, New York. Hedy Jones has lived in the East Village for 50 years. She's now completing Full Tilt, New and Selected Poems, and In Care of Worth Auto Parts, a collection of short fiction. We are very excited to hear her speak today about the role of women in the Beat generation. Please welcome Hedy Jones.
Oh, you can see me, huh? Or some of me, anyway. This is an ongoing problem. Thank you very much for inviting us to come here today to speak with you. We are, I guess, the original Beat Chicks, and here we are. So I'm going to talk about us today, and I call my talk Babes in Boyland because indeed that's what it was. Thank you for coming out today. I'm going to talk about us, and I hope that my black stockings might convince you of my authenticity, but it was too chilly to wear them this morning, so you'll have to take my word for it. For almost 2 decades now, I've been lecturing about us, the women who were on the scene back then in the 50s and 60s. And when someone asks informally, I describe myself as a card-carrying beat in order to locate myself on some kind of literary continuum. But that's still not an acceptable term for us old girls, is it? Let me explain. Quite some years ago, before many people were considering the beats in any historical way, a young woman studying at Columbia came to interview me for a paper she was writing, catching her breath after hiking up the nearly vertical stairs to my apartment. She said worriedly, "You weren't just beat chicks, were you?" I like to tell that story because this young woman's alarm at what she might find seems to point in 2 directions. First, along the idea that there were indeed beat chicks who would not be fit role model for mothers, and its opposite, that the stories told by all the men aren't really true, that we were as smart and as savvy as they, and that, in truth, the beat generation was, if only we get the story straight, chickless. But the question and the qualifiers seem to persist. At the first conference on the beats at NYU in 1994, the panel Joyce and I were on was titled Women and the Beats. When first approached by the editors who were eventually to issue the book Women of the Beat Generation, a letter to me was addressed as Dear Beat Woman. Subsequent publications have explained us in other ways. There's Breaking the Rule of Cool, subtitled Interviewing and Reading Women Beat Writers, and then there's Girls Who Wore Black, subtitled Women Writing the Beat Generation. In all cases, the fact is clear. The guys were beat, and we were the girls or women of them, or of their generation, whatever, because even though the word generation seems a misnomer to me, unless you're willing to believe that at one point, an entire generation was able to fit into my living room. But one thing you find when you get old is that hindsight has 20/20 vision. While you're young and in the middle of living your life, there are no labels, or if there are, you scoff at them and keep living. It's messy. We laughed when people called us beatniks, and though I'll acknowledge that I did meet a few chicks, I guess, most of the women with whom I was close were too busy struggling to give a damn about what they were called. Names didn't matter. The way mattered. Still, a lot of us, according to today's standards, would probably be considered failures or at best wimps. Most of us did not go on the road or were on it only briefly. And while in the middle of being beat, did a lot of the stuff that the vast majority of women of the 50s and 60s did. We cooked, made beds, did dishes, bore children. You'll have to forgive us. My late friend Helene Dorn, a card-carrying Black Mountain beat, if there is such a category, when confronted by feminist decrying positions she took then, used to say, complete with gestures, "Don't hit me, don't hit me, I didn't mean it, I didn't know any better." Few, I won't say none, few of us knew any better, including the women to whom we might have looked for advice and assistance. To quote from my memoir, in a 1959 Partisan Review article about the Beats, the critic Diana Trilling complained of the girls. She didn't find us pretty and hadn't liked our legs at all. So many blackest black stockings, she wrote. You could almost see her sniff. I never expected that only a year or so later I would meet the writer Mary McCarthy, who also published in Partisan, where, incidentally, I was the girl who ran the office, and that she, Mary McCarthy, would say, "I like your stockings." So much for our foremothers. Isn't it typical that, as with many an American phenomenon, an idea was reduced to a style? I have to add that at the opening of the Whitney Museum 1995 exhibit, Beat Culture and the New America, to which I had worn, along with my usual black stockings, my fabulous new Salvation Army Dior suit, a woman accosted me and said, "You don't look like a beatnik." One day during the 80s, I was guest lecturing in someone's class and found myself facing a somewhat hostile young woman who said impatiently, "Well, what really is different for women between then and now?" This was before I wrote my memoir, and her question started a whole train of thought, a line of defense, come to think of it. What did we do? Did we have a role in making things different for women today? And what was it? Well, I always like to start with underwear. I looked at that young woman who was wearing a minimum of it, or maybe none, plus jeans and an old shirt, and she had her legs all curled up, and she was comfortable. And she was therefore at her ease to speak her mind. To young people today, I offer this. You know what Madonna used to wear on the outside? Well, we had to wear it on the inside. I'm not mentioning this to trivialize the subject. Clothing, to shackle her or not, has been significant in the lives of women, not just American women, of course, and there's ample historical evidence for that. But I'm here to testify that it was no small thing to take off that girdle and let your female body be. Have you ever spent the day inside a cage? We hadn't been loose since the 20s, and 30 years was a long time to be tied up. The last order my father ever gave me was that I wasn't to wear pants on the Long Island Railroad. It's also no small thing to say that giving that body its own space was critical. Those of you who have simply said, "I'm getting an apartment," can't imagine what courage that act took and how suspect it made us in the prevailing social climate. Joyce left home with her stuff in a shopping cart, but I, coming from Queens to Manhattan, needed transportation. My folks had agreed reluctantly to give me a mattress, but though I was 21, they didn't want the neighbors to know I was leaving home. So they tied the mattress to the top of the car, and we left under cover of darkness. I had been planning that move for years and years, ever since, as I've written, ever since I was 6 and weighed 38 pounds. Yet up to the time I did leave for good in 1955, I had never known even one woman who lived independently. Independence, a crucial word. As I've written about Joyce, I liked her because, like me, she took her independence for granted. Both of us were paying the rent. Neither of us had ever considered wanting a man to support us. And having sex hadn't made us bad. I'll get to the sex later because that, in my case at least, involved the men, and I want to focus in on us chicks for a moment. How was a woman to achieve independence? I wasn't brought up to believe that I couldn't take care of myself, but independence was never presented as a viable option. It was suggested in every aspect of popular culture that a self-determined woman's life was miserable and lonely, and that sooner or later she'd be advised to solve her problems by finding a caretaker, or she'd, quote, come to a bad end. This was very real advice. Women ended up selling themselves in lots of ways, as they still, of course, do. Currently, we earn 77 cents to men's dollar, but back then it was something like 58. And there were very few professionals, women doctors, dentists, lawyers, college professors, etc. A beat chick couldn't just decide to go straight to law school. Look it up. My first job paid $35 a week. I got a raise to 50 when they let me write a newsletter. So you had to expect poverty as well as ostracism. And after you live long enough, you understand that one is as hard to take as the other. Just after my memoir came out, I taught a continuing education semester at the New School, where one of my students presented me with a very interesting question. "You're the same age I am," she said, "so we grew up at the same time. I never did any of the things you did, although I wish I had. How did you know to rebel?" It's my answer to her that interests me, because without thinking, I said, "Because if I hadn't, I'd have died." Shocked silence greeted this, and I went home kind of bemused because I felt the truth of it profoundly. What I meant, probably, was that the person standing in front of you wouldn't have existed if you want to call me, her, a prototype. But this prototypical woman rebel has died lots of times throughout history. Nowadays, thanks to feminists who came after us, you can read a fair amount about her, that rebel, and there's even a small body of work specifically about us, the beat chicks. You can find out about women like Bonnie Bremser and Janine Palmy Vega and others who were either writing or painting then, or at least getting ready to do just that. And while you're at it, you might think of those who got here and then went home, bearing in mind that in liberal as well as conservative times, the woman rebel sometimes does indeed die. Women are continually under pressure to conform more than men. Nevertheless, as I've written, there have always been women like us. Poverty and self-support is enough dominion. Still, if we weren't writing or painting or dancing, what were we doing while the boys were howling? At the conclusion of that 1994 panel at NYU, the one titled "Women and the Beats," a question was posed to me. In an earlier discussion came a voice from the back of the room. Someone said your role in publishing Eugen, that was a magazine that I published with my husband, Laura Jones, and the Totem Press books, was actually significant, that you were just the typist. Can you address this? Well, as I said then, the very idea assumes that books appear in bookstores and on library shelves, and eventually in exhibition display cases, on the wings of song. The early issues of Eugen magazine were, well, the best term is hand jobs, put together on the kitchen table. And of course, I did the typing. In those pre-computer days, on an IBM typewriter with proportional spacing, which meant typing a piece repeatedly so that it approximated print. You really had to be a believer, as I was, if you were willing to do this after 8 hours on your day job, if you were willing to buy paper with your salary, pay the offset printer and the rent on the typewriter, if you took time to arrange for distribution, fill orders, solicit ads, and then throw a party for the people who came to do the collating. I think the real question is, why? Why was the typist at all involved? Why, if her specific interests, as we know them today, were represented only marginally, if at all? I think here is where we have to look at why most of us babes were even in that boy land. Sex, of course, I did promise to get to that. But young people have always had sex in the basement, the back seat, the haystack. You could have sex anywhere. You just couldn't talk about it. Couldn't live as if it were part of your life. In leaving home for the village or North Beach, California, we had escaped to places where women could at least admit their desires. Of course, in popular culture, the fallen woman stereotype was still alive and well, and we were it. On display at the Whitney's Beat Culture and the New America show were some of the pulp paperbacks with beat in the title that were published back then. Just about all of them had a woman sprawled on a couch. This despite the fact that most of us were hardworking and often supported our men. Still, there was no doubt in anyone's mind what we were doing in our own apartments, because given half a chance, they would have been doing it too. The difference between us and them was simply that question of death. The only live life that I could envision for myself was one in which I functioned as a sexual human being. As I said, I never thought of myself or my woman friends as bad. We were merely reinventing, in this respect, and for our own time, a more satisfying, realer woman's life. But sex, as we know, has different consequences for men and women, and this leads to all the stories that should be told and retold now, especially right now, lest they happen again, the subterfuge required to obtain birth control, the inadequacies of the available methods of birth control, the illegal abortions, the botched abortions, the pain, the fear. Most of the stories from our time as beats are told as memoir, since the life itself had to be lived in secret. How risky it felt to say in a poem I wrote then, night, sky, sleep, lover. I suppose this brings me to relationships with the men of the Beat generation, since those were the ones I had sex with, and here I want to include not only the writers, but the painters and musicians, the entire downtown bohemia of the 50s, 60s. Now, I promise I didn't sleep with every one of them, though that might have been nice. But a few years ago at a book party, a woman my age who had not been a Beat chick said to me, I believe she said about Joyce and myself, "You had all the luck because you slept with all the right guys." Well, as you can imagine, I smarted over that one because our time with these men included a lot more than bedtime, and as a subset included, concomitantly, the struggle to maintain one's integrity in the life they defined, all the while trying to create new definitions for ourselves. I don't know that I'd call it luck. Instead, I like to think that strong women require strong men, or at least noisy ones. In any case, all of us were out there breaking the rules, even if some of us weren't then making art about it, or weren't right then, and may therefore be remembered only for our liaisons. Nevertheless, I like to give credit where it's due, and I'm happy to say that much of what I learned about art, much of what has served me during my writing career, can be traced to those parties and discussions with the men who were writing, because even what Kerouac called spontaneous prose calls rhythm into question, and I've been an editor and craft is still an issue. You had to have more than sex to keep you in boiling with your pride intact, because it was a man's world, no lie. As a woman, you had to believe that stirring things up in general would eventually define a new life for you in particular. You had to believe in the transformative power of art, in the word, and you had to believe yourself part of that process. Believe me, it was not for sex that I stayed up half the night to produce the books that are now in the collections of many major public and private libraries. I think it's common knowledge now that back then, very few women managed to work as artists, and that even when they did their best, efforts were often overlooked or at best underserved. Some of us did other things, editing magazines and books, for example, like I did. Logistically, it often just wasn't possible to be the breadwinner and the editor and the wife and mother and writer. But since some women did manage, I have come to see that sometimes our silences were due to the forbidden nature of the subject matter we wish to cover, a woman's life. Some of us were less afraid to tackle that, some of us better educated to make the attempt, some of us waited until the coast was clear. Often I've been asked to consider the question, how did women get published back then? And I'm afraid the answer to that is, with notable exceptions, if men wanted to include them. But in defense of these men, there weren't that many women demanding. Don't forget that 50 years ago, most women were still depicted petting their washing machines. Their real lives barely existed in the public mind. A lot of us, as I said, didn't know what we thought or how bad off we were. Myself, I stuck the poems from that time in a drawer, but I knew enough to save them for later. If you want to read a story about a real beat chick, I'd suggest trying to find Bonnie Bremser's 1969 book, Troya, Mexican Memoirs. There you'll find all the stereotypes about sex and drugs and all the strategies and tragedies of a woman on the road. My own ambition was never to embark on such a life, though I read On the Road with delight when it was first published, and I was just beginning my independent, sinful life. In my memoir, I've written all about what I wanted to do and what I hope to be, and since I've followed my desires successfully, I've always felt sympathetic to any woman who wanted to pit her life against propriety in her own way for her own good reasons. And since there's more than one way to skin a cat, a chick deserves the same respect. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a few questions, a short discussion at least.
Want water?
Yeah, I got water.
Oh, you got water. Good. Oh, now I can see you. That's nice.
So as a fellow girl in black, I'm very excited to talk to the original Beat Chicks today. I wish we had about 4 more hours because I would just ask you so many questions. I was going to start by talking more generally, asking you guys more generally questions about the movement. But I think for time purposes, I'd like to move straight towards your role as women in the movement. And Hettie, you touched on this. Could you talk a little bit more for both men and women? Where did the confidence to embrace what was viewed as transgressive and taboo, where did that confidence come from?
In my own case, and Joyce's maybe as well, I went to a women's college, and I had determined I wanted to go to a women's college then because to send a woman to college, most middle-class families felt they were sending them there to get a good husband and, marry their doctor. And I was not to be married off. I wanted to become something. I had no idea what. But that's how I felt. And going away from what was societal expectations was exactly what I wanted to do. And I had a lot of freedom when I was at college to do exactly that.
I too went to a women's college and also to a women's high school, Hunter High School in New York City. For some reason, I don't know, I always thought that when I grew up, I would work and I would make my way in the world and not be dependent on anyone. Part of that was due to a rather peculiar childhood. I was in the theater when I was a little girl, and I would show up and audition, and I would get jobs. I even collected unemployment insurance at the age of 11. The shortest person online. So I had this sense that I was someone who could go out. If I needed a job, I would go out and I would get a job. And I always, I think one reason I survived a lot of ups and downs was that I always managed to support myself so that I could keep my independence.
So when you became involved in this, I don't know, what do you want to call it, a scene, a movement? It wasn't a movement then. Can I call it a scene? Were there times that you felt removed from that scene based only because of your sex?
Well, very often in the middle of the night when the baby was crying.
Okay.
And the guys were at the bar, and you knew that you were waiting for 4 o'clock for the bar to close.
Okay.
But the talk was largely, literary talk was, in addition to being about style, was always about men's work. So you didn't really think about it. There was, of course, an occasional woman who was considered, somebody like Denise Levertov, who was very well respected, but for the most part, everybody talked about men and what they were doing and how they were advancing.
How great they are, always.
But that was a widespread cultural problem. There was, if you wanted to be a young writer or a young artist and you were a woman, you kept getting messages that, nothing you produced could possibly be worthwhile. I mean, even in my women's college, Barnard, I had male professors who taught creative writing. At the same time, they were supposedly teaching us creative writing, but also very busily trying to discourage us from engaging in writing. And I remember, I remember the remarks that my professor would write, things that would probably get someone fired today, like, quite the little existentialist, aren't we? That was a nice one. But another one, oh, you girls have such dreary little lives. And I read that and I thought, I'm going to show him. I'm going to write about those dreary little lives. And that remark was one of the things that led to my decision to write my first novel. I think one odd thing about young women trying to write in those days was it was almost, for a lot of women, it was almost secret. Like my friend Elise Cowan, whose poem you heard, she was writing poems. She never talked about them. She never even showed them to me, although I was her best friend. You didn't, the women didn't discuss their work. We went to reading after reading and listened to all these male poets reading. It wouldn't have occurred to us to read their own work. It wouldn't have occurred to me to read the novel I was writing, although when I was 21 years old, I got a contract for it from Random House. I was in a workshop at the New School taught by the editor of Random House, and he gave me a contract for the novel on the basis of 50 pages. But nobody was interested in my novel. They go, oh, it would just be some commercial thing, and I just accepted that, and I kept working. I have to say that one of the rare men who very actively encouraged me in my writing was Jack Kerouac.
So I think we have time, unfortunately, for one last question.
Oh dear.
I want to ask you, actually, it's a two-parter, both from Ann Douglas's introduction to your minor characters, Joyce. She argues that the Beat Generation, in part, laid the groundwork for the feminist movement. And I want to know, Hettie, you touched on this briefly, I think. I want to know if you agree with that, as well as her claim that, quote, the best available models for feminine self-assertion have sometimes been male.
Well, I think, and I think Hettie would agree with me here. I think we were sort of a transitional generation.
Yeah.
We were kind of a bridge between the past and the future, which would come very quickly, in the 60s. In the 60s, it was it began to be a very changed landscape for women. But we were transitional. We were not so much concerned with reforming our relationships with men as with our fight to have, to have sex lives, to have independence. Those were the things that concerned us at that time. We weren't really critiquing the male-female relationship that much.
But someone recently said we were not feminists. And my whole approach to life I don't know, I never put a label on it, but I was always ready to defend myself. I was ready to defend other women, befriend other women as well, and take care. We had a rather close group of young women on that scene. Some of us were mothers. We all worked. We were all trying to figure things out. We helped each other get illegal abortions. We helped each other find babysitting so we could go out to an occasional dance class at night. We helped each other lead our physical lives and maintain our courage in the face of what was disdain. When popular culture, there was a terrible article in Life magazine that depicted the Beats.
Oh,
Do you
yeah,
remember
yeah.
that? And my mother called me up and said, "Oh, it's so terrible. Oh, what are you doing?" And I had to write her an irate letter saying, "I give my baby a bath every night." You know?
Yeah.
Just, ridiculous assumptions on the part of the popular culture that we were no good. That's it. We were strewn on the couch or doing something else very bad.
Well, I want to thank you for not only being strewn on the couch first, I guess, but also for coming here today and speaking so freely. I just want to be clear to the audience, we have a book signing after this. There are books for sale from both of our distinguished guests, and they will be signing books on this side of the room. I was going to say my right, but that's your left for everybody else.
Thank you
thank
all
you
for
very
coming
much.
out.
Thank you.